Let's
Oh,
go.
yung mga,
There's
yeah,
hope.
exactly, di ba? And you will be paid by the Spanish government. I mean, it's not much, no? You'll be paid, I think here in Madrid, you're paid 1,200 euros a month. But, that's
But
more
what
than
about your
enough
like saan
to,
ka titira? Saan ka Anong
well, you have to find an apartment, no?
Ikasya
Apartment
mo
to
sa
rent. But,
1,200 but yung accommodation mo?
well, as you discovered here, the cost of living in Spain is
Yeah,
very
much
affordable.
lower.
Things are actually cheaper than Manila. So
Right.
my niece, my brother's daughter, is here in Madrid now as a auxiliar de conversación, and she's
Right.
surviving on the
Really?
1,200
So
salary
like with
stipend. Yeah.
75, $80,000 pesos per month, you can have a pretty reasonable and dignified in Madrid.
Well, she's sharing a large apartment with three other
Right,
Filipinas.
right.
And yeah, so kanya-kanyang room. They share the cost of the
Yeah,
apartment, the electricity, the Wi-Fi, but it
right.
all works out. And there are hundreds of Filipinos doing that here in
Interesting.
Madrid now, here in
Wow.
Spain, all over Spain.
Interesting.
So that's a program that Filipinos can look into.
I didn't
It's
know it's
only
that
good.
affordable in Madrid.
Yeah, it's
Wow.
the prices here are pretty good.
Yeah, with the
Before
food, I
coming
can
here,
see that. Yeah, with the food and transportation, I could clearly see the difference. It's huge. It's huge. Super laki ng difference with Philippines, but definitely with other developed countries, no? Especially Japan or Singapore, even Singapore, much more expensive than Spain, no? Forget about US, right? That's really and
irony.
we're talking about Madrid, right? The capital, not some barrio or whatever in Spain. We're talking about the capital, by the way, here, right? I mean, so counterpart would be New York, Tokyo, Seoul, right? Or Taipei, yeah, or Singapore. Can you give us an idea
Very
of
affordable.
prices? Like if you want to rent a decent, let's say, studio, right? Biglang interesado na ako. Like how much? Sorry, I'm like what? Takado? Like sorry, the Ilocano is like, that's parang you might end up saving money like in Spain, right? I mean, like, interesting, right? Parent ko na lang ano ko dito. Tapos, you get what I'm saying? Like the Ilocano is already doing calculations. Like, I'll rent this one here and I'll get this one. I'll put this one there. No, because bro, I mean, like, I really love the chill life there because it gives me time to do my work through the day, and then at this I have time to have coffee, sit down, breathe a little bit, fresh air, walk a little bit, like things that I usually cannot do in other big cities, whether it's in Taipei, in Tokyo, in Manila, or in New York, whatever. Like usually they're being very different in schedule from what I had there in Madrid. So I really appreciated that because I was still working intensively while I was there. I mean, you could see from my schedule 2 a.m., 7 a.m. But still, it's the overall tempo and cadence of life was just something that I found refreshing. And parang almost nag-retreat ako, parang ganun yung feel ko, even if we were in this doing a lot of things. Can you tell us a little bit about the expense and all? Sorry, especially for the more takad Ilocano styles like me, right? Now, okay, let's say
basically,
middle class, all right, middle class. It's just
Tacaños. Okay, just kidding. So there is basically parity between in the prices of real estate and rentals in, let's say, Madrid and Makati, Madrid and Manila. So
right.
if you were going to rent a place in, let's say, Makati, Salcedo Village, if you rent in the equivalent of Salcedo Village in Madrid, pareho lang. If you're gonna rent in a place in Cubao, in Manila, if you went to the sort of equivalent, it would be the same price. But then it's a false equivalent in the sense that wala naman dito Cubao. Maganda yung area. No offense to Cubao, but mas maganda yung area dito.
Naku, magalit si Lord Rivera sa'yo. Favorite na yung mga Cubao, lalo yung mga cinema dyan. Yung mga huling El Bimbo, mga ganyan movies doon sa Cubao, di ba? Cubao, Princeton, Cubao.
But you know what I'm saying, Richard, no? So the prices are the same from what you get in Manila, you'll get it here in Madrid, but with the added bonus that if you want, the range is the same. But if you get a cheaper place outside of the centro, so it's a little further away, much cheaper, maybe half the price of living in the middle of Madrid. But the good thing is that the transport system is so darn efficient. But even if you lived outside of Centro, you take the metro, you'll be in Centro in 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. So, di ba? You can't compare.
Yeah, like we
But
visited the
prices,
Rizal monument there. Is that considered a little bit outside the center, right? It kind of felt like you're in the not one provincia, but in some sort of municipality. Didn't feel like a capital, right? Once you go down from the like how far is that from the center? Or what are the price range? Let's say I want to get an apartment close to Rizal. So that I wake up, I see his monument, whatever. Like what are we looking at? Is it like 600 euros per month, 700 euros, 500 euros for a decent one bedroom or studio? Sorry, ginawa
siguro
kitang travel agent.
in that area, siguro mura na dyan, mga 500 euros siguro. That's sort of like living in Caloocan. I mean, the prices are much lower than living in
Right.
Makati.
Interesting. Very
So yeah,
interesting.
affordable
It's
if you
really
want to live in the
affordable.
area that's not too farther away, but it's half the price.
Right. It's very affordable.
And transport.
The other thing I noticed, amigo, is that parang walang vlogger masyado sa Spain, no? It's like when I was like vlogging, I could see when the kids were like, what is this guy doing? You know what I'm saying? Like, I felt so good na walang vloggers masyado doon, di ba? Kasi it's so annoying. You go different, I mean, I'm not gonna say which countries you go there, aside from Philippines, right? And like there are people dancing crazy and doing TikTok. Like, come on, man. Like, I'm just enjoying the view here, okay? I mean, like, you're not even moving well, you know? Buti pa kung ako yung nagsasayaw, di ba? So at least I didn't see any of those, let's just say, chicanery and clown nonsense, di ba? Right? I mean, hindi sila masyadong online social media people there in Spain too, right?
I think meron din, but maybe not as much as in
Exactly. I mean,
Manila.
of
I
course,
mean,
meron, yeah, but definitely not the same level, di ba?
yes.
So life is really slower. Life is less social media obsessed, right? I mean, that's amazing. And it's a different state of being, no? And yun nga and it's not posh in terms of living cost, right? Unlike in London, unlike in certain parts of Germany, like Munich or München, right? It's really high cost, I think, to get a decent studio, at least 2,000 euros or something, or 1.5, relatively decent one. So it's a 2-to-1 range almost, no, in Spain and some of the other countries, and you're still gonna get a very high level, high quality of life, diba? They're all EU countries. It's not like diba? So I think that's really impressive. By the way, I just have a question. Like, of course, with Jorge, we discussed the transformation of Spain from a relatively backward feudalistic country, right, not long ago, to a relatively decent modern country. I mean, obviously, Spain has a lot of problems. I'm aware of that, etc. Although I don't completely agree with Jorge's libertarian economic views on public debt and all. I have a different stance on that, but never mind. It was not an economic debate. But like your parents were there in the 1950s, right? This is the early post-war period when Spain was super isolated. Franco was still trying to create a new order, right? Are your parents also, did your parents or mom in particular, did she comment about how far Spain has come over the past 56 years throughout her lifetime? Because yes, because Spain was not really in good spot, right? In the 50s, pretty pobre country too, right? Sorry for
Yeah, my
sounding
mom.
pobre, right? I just want to emphasize the transformation.
No, but you're absolutely right. No, in the stories of my mom when they were students here, she remembers Spain as quite backward,
Yeah.
and the Philippines was way ahead. And my mom used to say that, wow,
Really?
we had the biggest allowance in the Colegio Mayor,
Interesting.
and yeah, and they were the best. The Filipinas were the best dressed. And remember at the time the peso dollar exchange rate was one
Oh
to two.
yeah, yeah. You're right.
So
That
Philippines
was really
really
what made a difference. Yeah. Peseta.
right. And my
What was the pera niya? Peseta.
peseta,
Yeah.
the peseta.
Yeah. It doesn't sound legit, right? It's like peso sounds more legit, right? Peseta. It's like I'm sure like exchange rate is like 1,000 to 1. I'm just kidding. Yeah. Talagang umangat ang
Something like
Spain, no? Talagang umangat ang Spain. I mean, you could say that. Now, obviously, I had some Spanish friends, Spanish Filipino friends who kind of, naman na-annoyed, but I sense na parang they felt I'm not giving enough credit to the so-called Spanish economic miracle, no, from 1954, 55 until early 1970s. So this is the latter decades of the Francoist regime, where in fairness, they were kind of more like Korea and Japan, right, in terms of rapid economic growth. But still, Spain was still not a super amazing place, even up until the 70s and 80s. My understanding was it's still a relatively backward country compared to Germany or even France, right?
Yeah, Spain didn't have it easy kasi after the Second World War, they were devastated by the Civil War. And then when the US put the Marshall Plan in place for the rest of Europe, Spain was excluded.
Because they're neutral.
Yeah, but they were neutral, but eventually the US said, okay, Spain can enter the Marshall Plan, but Britain didn't want to. And they were really worried with it, the British public, the American
That's a
public,
good
because
point.
unlike Greece and Portugal, which were under dictators at the time, they felt that hindi acceptable si Franco because of the roots of Franco's dictatorship, which was supported by
Friendship
Nazi
with the
Germany.
fascist. Let's just call it what it is. There was the fascist element, Phalangist fascist, which was not the case in Greece, and because the one in Greece and Portugal was anti-communist, but not necessarily, they were not Axis friends, right? And we know that in the case of Franco, I mean, that's what the whole Guernica, the painting is all about, right? If I'm not mistaken, German technology was used there for the aerial bombing of Guernica and the horrors that was, of course, immortalized for proper reflection by no less than Pablo Picasso. And I think we spent 10, 15 minutes just standing there in front of Guernica and observing everything and reflecting on the country, right? I mean, how I wish. I mean, the closest thing we have to Guernica is Polarium, right? Which is obviously not done for our era, right? But it has a resonance, right? I was thinking if I'll do a novel, I think the title should be Spolarium, right? So you get what I'm saying, right? I think we spent a lot of time. We don't have to go to the details what we discussed because it will be a totally different discussion for now. I'm still giving Magellan Jr. some, let's see what he's going to do on the other fronts, right? Without forgetting, of course, the horrors of the past under the Marcos regime, the father's regime. Now, let's transition a little bit to what do you think, anong kalagayan ng mga OFWs natin in Spain? What are things that are working and what are things that perhaps, we can do some improvement on that, and including, in terms of government intervention or help. What do you think about that? As a Filipino resident in Spain, ano yung mga napansin mo mga tendencies, patterns, and the goods and bads and the uglies of that? Yep.
Okay, speaking of the OFW community here, you'll find the OFWs all over Spain. Most of them, 3/4. Okay, there are 200,000 Filipinos here in Spain. 3/4 of which you will find in the Comunidad de Madrid, and the rest in the autonomous region of Catalonia, where Barcelona is.
Right.
The rest, you find them in Andalusia, in the major cities of Marbella and Malaga, and some in Sevilla. Outside of peninsular Spain, you'll find them in the Canary Islands and in the Balearic Islands. Ibiza has 2,500 Filipinos, and I think you have family there also.
Yeah,
no?
of course, yeah.
And then, the Filipinos here came in several waves. A little about the history.
What are the waves? Yeah.
Okay, well, the first. Well, okay. Between the 16th century and the 19th century, there were no Filipino migrations to Spain.
Yeah.
It was the other way, no? But
were we banned?
The first wave.
May ban ba sa atin?
No,
no.
Just no reason. It's just no reason, no way. It's not practical.
Exactly, yeah.
So the first wave came in the 1860s. That was the Ilustrados. They were pretty much the first wave of young Filipinos who wanted to go there to study, liberal ideas, blah, blah, blah. And then because they could afford, because the Philippines economy was good then because of agriculture. Best example, Rizal. And then the second wave came at the end of World War II. This was in 1936. The bombing of Manila obliterated the areas where the Mesticeria lived. So this was Intramuros, Malate. So after the war, the survivors, the mestizos, the Spanish Filipinos left en masse, went back to Spain. That was the second wave. The third and fourth waves happened in the 60s and 80s, and these were composed mostly of working-age Filipina women who went there to work as house help. And say that the last wave
hindi lang sa Middle
happened
East. Hindi lang sa gitnang silang marami ring kasambahay na sa Spain. Wait lang, what's with Spain and the kasambahay culture? Because you don't see that I don't think as much in Germany or Nordic countries. Probably not even as much in France and Italy, right? Is this a very Espanol thing? What's going on there? I don't want to be Occidentalists, Orientalists, whatever you want to call it, right? Like, parang Madrid has, I think, the highest per capita of kasambahays, no, in any Western capital. I mean, it's just what's going on there? Is this a Spanish thing? Is what's going on there? Because they're also Latin Americans, right? Colombianos, whatever, like who also are in that industry. I know
Well,
about it because marami issues nung pandemic time, because it became a big issue. I think there was a BBC News about an analysis about it na marami hindi nakakauwi, or they felt maltreated during, pandemic, or they will be stuck at home. And I realized, so Madrid is kind of like Manila too pala, no? Interesting, right? Yeah, can you tell us about that? Yeah.
So if you're asking why maraming kasambahay here, well, I think it's a function of the fact that if a Filipino comes here, they are not okay. It's the language. The language issue is a major thing. So when a Filipino comes here, they are limited. There are limited kinds of jobs they can have because usually the Filipinos do not speak Spanish. Now, this is a bit of history, no? Why we can't learn Spanish here, but okay, the majority of working Filipinos here, the women work as housekeepers and babysitters, while the men usually work as kitchen in the restaurant industry, in the kitchen. And they're relegated to that position basically because they do not have enough fluency in the Spanish language. And given that Spain has one of the lowest level of bilingualism in Europe, kailangan you have to speak Spanish here. There are other industries where there are Filipinos also, like the hotel industry. But again, the Filipinos in the hotel industry here are room boys or room girls. So you see, they're not able to work really in the reception area. Yeah, walang upward mobility because of the language barrier. So that's into whether it's training Filipinos in Manila before they come to Spain to speak better Spanish, or having a program in place here in Spain. Maybe it's something the embassy or some NGOs can look into to help the Filipino community here. Because you teach the Filipinos here to learn better Spanish, to speak better Spanish, you break that sort of glass ceiling, and the upward mobility is there. They'll get better jobs because we already have the reputation here of being hard workers, trustworthy. Kulang na lang, it's the language.
Yeah, that's
and also.
And getting citizenship, right? You need to have basic proficiency in Spanish if you want to be a citizen of Spain, right? And once you're a citizen of Spain, all sorts of benefits come, right? In terms of job, occupational tenure, in terms of healthcare, all sorts of things come, right? So like I understand, like there are Filipinos who have lived there decades, or at least a decade and so, and they're not really en route to citizenship because they're not comfortable taking the examination, the proficiency examination, right? I mean, that's the understanding I have. What's going on there?
Yeah, right. I know some Filipinos here who've lived there for 25 years. And
25 years, wow, that's a lifetime. Yeah.
They still do not speak fluent Spanish.
Calle is like it's street Espanol, like calle is no, but what's going on there?
Yeah. I call Español por la calle. Español por la calle, they learn Spanish on the street, grammatically incorrect. And, you can't hold a decent job if you're speaking in pidgin Spanish.
Right.
So, yeah, sayang eh. In the level of Spanish naman that you need here is not super fluent, but just grammatically correct. And that can be addressed.
The sentence construction.
Taking classes. Yeah. But the Instituto Cervantes in Manila, I've heard, has the most number of enrollees of any Instituto Cervantes in the world.
Manila, yeah.
So,
but Jorge was telling me it had nothing to do with Spain. These are folks who want to work in Florida or in San Diego or I don't know, New Mexico. It's like, what? And I was like, oh, no. Like, if you go to those areas, you can completely get away with no English whatsoever, just speak Spanish, right? But you cannot get away with not speaking Spanish, right? You know what I mean? Like, it's crazy, right? You go to South, by the way, let's be very clear. A lot of those areas used to be controlled by Spain, right? And I mean, I always say, look at the gringos. It's even called New Mexico because they just grabbed what was part of Mexico, right? So they didn't even bother to really change the name, right? Texas, right? Texas was also part of course Mexico. There's California in Mexico because California was really part of Mexico. You know what I'm saying? Like, so it's crazy. Yeah, you're right. But I didn't know that. Like, so they learn Spanish here so like, they can work in the U.S. in Florida and those kinds of things. Did you know that? I mean, I had no idea. I thought, of course, you're gonna go to Spain, be EU citizen, whatever. But no, hindi America talaga pa rin eh. So ginagamit pa rin to get. You tell me about like what did you know about that? Like, what do you think about it? It's interesting.
Yeah, I know about it. I had a good friend in Manila before, no, got a job in New York. He's a doctor. He got a job at the Sinai. And in his application, he said that he spoke basic Spanish. So when he got accepted to the job, medyo panic siya. And he said, Manolet, patay, I don't really speak Spanish. So for 3 weeks before he left, he tapped me to teach him basic
Wow.
Spanish. Because ang daming mga Latinos in New York.
Exactly, yeah, all over the US, right? Yeah.
The borough that he'd be working in basically was a Spanish-rich area, Latino-rich area. So yeah, they speak Spanish in the United States. The United States, I think, is the third biggest Spanish-speaking country in the world after Mexico and one other country.
Wow.
More Spanish speakers in the United States than in Spain.
Yeah,
So,
of course. I mean, and malakas yung birth rate ng mga itong mga Spanish speaking na to, right? Medyo, and we don't even know the real numbers, right? The real, kasi ang dami TNT din ng mga di ba, Latinos there. So like, woo, I know where this is going. Like, give it 50 years. Spanish will be the #1 language spoken in the US, di ba? It will be like kind of like Philippines kung saan yung official language is English, but really not most people like, but you can get away with Spanish, right? I don't know. It's going crazy, right? Anyway, before I say something politically incorrect again, I get into trouble. Yeah. Now let's talk about something that maybe you should talk about. Of course, you're a Paterno, so can you tell me about like your understanding of history of Ilustrados? Because we also had this conversation with Jorge, and I'm glad that he also agrees with me. Our sense is we love Rizal, but why should he get all the credit, right? When in fact he was part of an ecosystem, right? And this ecosystem was enabled in a good way, right? Was facilitated, let's just say, because of contribution of many people, including Pedro Patero, who I think is not only underappreciated for his artistic and intellectual contribution. I mean, he was a brilliant guy. He also got, I think, his doctoral in law, right? In Madrid. He was also kind of a prodigy, very smart guy, but Ninay had even footnotes. Amazing, right? I mean, he was doing it like postmodern style, footnoted novels, right? And he was a complete pioneer. But more importantly, I think we kind of discuss it, is that he served as really the eventologist. No, I mean, like he had the social capital that allowed for newcomers, up and coming guys, fresh from the boat folks, right, to meet the elite of Europe, right? The best minds, the best culturatis, best writers in España would go to residence of Pedro Paterno, and then that's really how the Ilustrados, a lot of them from very humble background with humble resources, by European standards, maybe not by they will get to meet these fantastic people. And we know in the world of high art and high politics, connections, networks is everything, right? I mean, you can be the smartest guys, but if you don't meet the right people, you will just be an unrecognized genius, right? So I think Pedro Paterno made a lot of contribution. I'm not saying this because you come from that, you have that family. I'm saying this because I just feel we have this tendency in the Philippines of giving one person all of the credit, when in fact it's really an ecosystem that contributed to it, right? Can you tell us a little bit
that's
about
fine.
that? Yeah.
Yeah, when you think of the Ilustrados, we tend to think of Rizal, Lopez Jaina, Marcelo del Pilar, but really, yeah, it was a big group of people. It was a community,
Right.
and in that community, Pedro Paterno was probably the first there. No? Unlike the others, Pedro Paterno went to Spain at the tender age of 14.
Wow.
Rizal already went. So Pedro Paterno went there very early.
Yeah.
And went there. Really, he was sent to Spain because of the way things were going in Manila. In fact, the year after Pedro Paterno arrived in Madrid, his father was implicated along with Gomez Burgos and Zamora,
Right. Comporta,
and
yeah.
in Guam. So Pedro left. His parents sent him here also for for
Safe.
those considerations.
Yeah, for safety. Yeah, so let's get that very clear, huh? Pedro Paterno's father, right, was seen as a revolutionary, right? And he was a Quaternion.
Nationalist.
So
Plotting against
yeah,
Spain.
so everyone knows about Paterno coming from a thriving commercial family, Chinese Filipino family, but they don't know that. I actually also didn't know about his father, right? I knew about his contribution, but I didn't know about the father, and that was a very good important fact that we have to keep in mind. No, so he was in Spain also under the shadow of potential harassment back home because of the situation of his father, right? So he came from a privileged and yet persecuted, increasingly persecuted also family, right? I mean, let's just say what it was, right? And then what? And then he comes to Spain. He's 14-year-old. What's going on there?
Yeah, and he studied in Spain. He got his he studied law. He in University of Salamanca, and I think he got his
Oh,
doctorate in
Salamanca,
Madrid.
not Madrid. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Salamanca, and he, while growing up here, he spent more time in Spain than in Manila. When you think about
Yeah,
it, so
because a
he was truly.
14-year-old lang. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And by the time that the other Ilustrados had arrived, I mean his now contemporaries, he had already made a big network of
Yeah.
connections here with important Spaniards, and that was very important. He was able to use his network for the benefit of the rest of the Ilustrados. He got to introduce Rizal to the different important politicians, governors, royalty. And at the time, that's capital. That was capital
Yeah,
at
and
the time.
especially if you're petitioning, right, the Supreme Court of Spain or petitioning yung deputados, no? I mean, the Congress. I mean, if you're just some random guy from the colony showing up, you won't get too far, right? Probably barely through the door. But now you met this guy, he knows about you. Oh, this Rizal guy, smart guy who came from Philippines. You build sympathy, right? I mean, lobbying is very, very important. So he was almost like a consultancy firm, right? It was like a lobbying firm. Like it was putting all of these important people together. Again, I'm just saying this because I feel people are not appreciating these things as much, right? How political lobbying is so important in the imperial capital, just like as it is nowadays in Washington, D.C. But what about his mind? His mind. I mean, he seems to be very comfortable with the high culture of Spain, of Europe. Ninay, for many people who have read it in its original, are very impressed by it. Like you, what as objective as you can get. I know you really want to be objective about this. Like, what is your understanding of that? Or within your family, how do you talk about his art, his mind, his intellect?
Pedro Paterno was a Renaissance man. He
Right.
was in anything and everything, and he did it with passion. He wrote many books, and always when he would write a book, it would be with the intention of presenting the Philippines in the best light. You see, at the time, really, uh, like it or not, the Spaniards didn't know much about the Philippines, and they
Yeah.
had so many misconceptions of their far-flung colony in the East, in the Far East. So Pedro Paterno wanted to change that view by writing these novels. Some say they were too romanticized, some say they were already works of fiction. Pero that's how you had to work. That's how you had to do things at that
If
time.
you're a
You had to
pioneer,
follow.
especially, right? You're the first. So first, planchain mo muna, diba? Like you have to get people interested. They to bother even about the existence of the Philippines, right? And then you work it from there. Kaya some would argue that No Limitang Hera wouldn't have made as much impact or gained as much traction if there was not a Ninay that came before it. No, I mean maybe I'm stretching it, but you always need a shield for a sword, right? The two kind of go together, right? There was a kind of a symbiotic dynamic there that I think is also not appreciated, right? Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, when Pedro Paterno wrote Ninay, he wanted to portray more of a good relationship between Philippines and Spain. So medyo I think Pedro Paterno also was surprised when the Noli Me Tangere came out 2 years later at how
Yeah.
fiery it was, because it was approaching the same goal through different means.
Yeah.
Pedro wanted more conciliatory, but Pedro was knew how it was at the time. No, You
I mean, his
you
father
play with
was
fire.
exiled
Exactly.
to. I mean, back then Guam was not as beautiful as it is today. Let's be very clear about it. It was the backwater of backwater, right? So it's not like the guy was a privileged person who didn't care about things back when he wanted to make people interested in the Philippines to begin with, and obviously Rizal work it from there, di ba? So parang kasi 2 years yung gap between Ninay and Noli Me Tangere. Was Ninay well read in Spain? Obviously not in the Philippines as much as it should, but was it read in Spain? I mean, given the kind of contacts he has and the eloquence and erudition that he had at his disposal, is there any evidence, or what is your understanding of how Ninay circulated among the Spanish elite or the literati?
That's a good question. I do not know how many books were published or how well circulated it was here, but I do know that Pedro and his father spoke about how to approach dealing with Spain in terms of literature, and they both agreed that it was wiser to approach it in a more steady,
Subtle
uh,
way. Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Maybe because of the experience of Maximo Paterno, his father, being
Yeah.
exiled, that you can achieve the same end in a more studied
Yeah.
manner.